Welcome to another video tutorial from 2dgameartguru.com. Today I'm working in Affinity Designer to show you some simple ways to create trees. Starting out with the very basics, a circle and a rectangle. We have a recognizable tree. Duplicating that and transforming the circle into a curve allows me to move the center node. A triangle instead of the circle, and we all see it as a pine tree. Now you might say these simple trees really don't cut it. Let's put them into the scene I prepared earlier, and you'll see if placed in the far background, they actually do work with a scene and allow you to quickly populate far distant backgrounds. I vary the size and the color to match the background and try to mix them up so it doesn't look like it's just one tree. Of course, you can add more to the tree than just the two shapes. By duplicating the triangle, I get a more elaborate pine tree. Let's take a step from there and add more detail to the tree. I start with the circle, add more smaller circles to give it less of a perfect round shape, but more something that looks kind of organic. Also changing the color of the trunk and give it a gradient to show some shading in the tree. I add a few more circles. At the moment, pretty much just randomly placing them in a lighter color. Instead of just using circular blobs, I turn the circles into crescents by duplicating them and turning them into subtraction compounds. By holding the Alt key and combining the two shapes via the subtract, you create a compound. With multiple shapes, I combine them to an add compound first and then duplicate that and subtract to get some simple shading shapes. I group the shapes and copy the tree into the scene. It'll be placed in the midground. Seeing it has some shading, I will add a shadow underneath. A quick way to add variation is by assigning a color overlay to the group. I give it a darker color and set the blend mode to multiply. The same tree looks slightly different, allowing me to quickly create variations and populate a scene with the same tree. For the next tree, I want to work with clusters and add complexity to the trunk. The rectangle is turned into curves. I choose the transform mode, which allows me to adjust multiple nodes at the same time, and then start adding branches. When creating a tree, keep in mind that they usually grow from thick to thin. Very few trees have branches that are thicker than their trunk. I'm just working with straight lines, adding a few branches. They will be covered mostly by my clusters of foliage. Adding more detail usually pays off. For this video, I'll try and keep it relatively quick. This is my basic trunk, and I'll add a circle as the base of my foliage. In order to keep it simple, I use teardrop shapes for the leaves. I keep them in the same color as the circle and just place them around, trying to get a somewhat interesting looking irregular cluster. I turn all the shapes into a group and duplicate the group, give it a slightly lighter color, flip it, rearrange it to make it look less like an identical copy, and duplicate that one again. I give it an even lighter color for the top layer and some individual teardrops just for the very top. The idea is that the light comes from the top, so the darker parts are below while the lighter ones are on top. I turn this group into a symbol. Go to View, Studio, Symbols, and it brings up the Symbols panel. Once you create a new symbol, it shows in there. The advantage of the symbols is the ease to edit all the copies of the symbol in one go. For now, I'm just creating 2 more copies and group the symbol. That allows me to color the group. If I add a color overlay to the group now to darken one and make one lighter, it colors the group, not the symbol. Otherwise, all symbols would now go into the darker green. I changed the blend mode of the color overlay. I use multiply for the darker colors and an overlay. You can also use add or vivid color for the lighter tone. With these 3 clusters, I'm now building up the foliage in my tree, starting with the darker color, placing it behind the trunk, duplicating, rotating, flipping that shape, and then adding the next lighter shape on top. Again, I'm trying to vary rotation and size a little bit so it does not look quite that repetitive. I do the same thing with the lightest color, just adding it at the very top. To shade the trunk, I add a darker shape inside, using the trunk as a clipping mask. I select all the elements of the tree, group it, copy it, and place it in the scene with the previous trees. The next tree setup is something that I used for mobile phone games where you have limited assets. So I reused the branches and the leaves in various constellations. This setup would make 5, 6, 7 different looking trees from the same graphics. By flipping, rotating, or just leaving out parts that make up the tree, it's a similar approach as the one before, except with a few more variations. Instead of just having one cluster with different colors, I use 6 different clusters and different branches. A lot of trees can be created with a similar modular setup. Let's take this pine tree for example. I can elongate the trunk by duplicating the element, add more branches, and build up the shape. Let's do a quick variation, duplicating some of the shapes and creating a miniature version of this tree. I'm slowly filling this scene with different trees. They might not look consistent, but that is due to the nature of this video, to show you different approaches. For the next tree, I'm using a very different setup. I start out with a circle again, nothing new there, which is my base shape, but then rather than add elements to it, I add a textured brush to it. I created these 2 different textures brushes with lines and pressure curves. The pressure curve has the shape of a half leaf. When I assign this to my circle, there is the brush, adjust the size and the color, I end up with an oval of leaves. I duplicate the ellipse and create 2 lighter versions. I adjust the stroke color and match the fill color using the color picker. I match the stroke widths to be consistent for all 3 circles. I had the scale with object turned on, so the smaller circle has a smaller stroke. Once they are evenly sized, it looks a little bit more consistent. I add transparency to the inner two circles to blend them into the darker circle, and then add additional lines assigning the same brush pattern in a smaller size to it. Assigning transparency to those lines, duplicating them, recoloring them in a darker shade gives some texture to the tree. I finish it off by adding some individual leaves in a lighter color, adjusting the color slightly as I move further down into the darker parts of the tree, so they are visible but don't stand out too much. I add a simple rectangle for the trunk, give it a slight gradient to match the shading of the tree, select all the elements and copy it into the scene. It looks different from the rest, it has more detail, very different style, but again it is rather flexible. I can quickly make a variation of this one by darkening it, as I've done before, using a color overlay set to multiply, and then converting the circles, I select all three, into curves and moving the center node upwards to get a different tree shape. I can scale this down and adjust the curvature of my shading elements. As long as you avoid sharp corners, textured brushes are a very viable option to create foliage. They are a very fast way, but not as editable as vector shapes. For the last tree, I would like to combine the detail of the vector brushes with the editability of the clusters I used earlier. I start with the trunk. An easy way to shade a trunk is by duplicating it and moving a lighter version inside the darker version, creating a clipping mask and then just adjusting a few nodes. For my cluster, I start with a circle. Use a line with an adjusted pressure curve to create the leaf shape from the textured brushes. Adjusting the width influences the shape of the leaf dramatically. More nodes in the pressure curve do not really help once you curve the leaf. I try to keep it simple and just use 3-4 nodes at the most, and then start placing the leaves around my ellipse. The idea is the same as before. You want to create a cluster that looks interesting without standing out too much. Minor variations in size, curve and stroke width make it more interesting. I select all the elements, group them, duplicate them and mirror them in a slightly lighter color. This will be the next cluster on top. I reposition the leaves and add some transparency. I duplicate this group and give it a lighter color, move some of the leaves, add more transparency, and try to create a cluster that is lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. Creating complex symbols with gradients and transparencies can easily slow down your computer. An alternative that seems to be less heavy on the CPU are embedded objects. I copy the design, create a new document from the clipboard, and save this design as a new Affinity Designer file. I can then drag that one back into my initial document. The initial group shows up as a group in the layer panel, while the new file I dragged in shows up as an embedded object, which means I can use that the same way I'd used the symbol before. I can change the colors, darken one version and lighten the other. I don't have to worry about grouping it first because the embedded object is a different entity from my initial file. I start with the darker layers, get to the lighter layers on top, and the lightest shapes at the very top. By clicking on the Edit document in the top menu, I can bring up a new tab for the design and make changes. I duplicate one of the leaves and give it a lighter color. These new leaves are not in the initial group. Once I save this or close the tab, it will be in my original design. There we go, the new version has the lighter leaves and it has them in all the copies of the embedded object. I group this, place it in the scene, rearrange my scene a little bit, and here are the trees. 6 different ways to quickly and easily create interesting looking trees. I started out using simple shapes for the trees in the very background, added more details and a little bit of shading, then went on and had some leaves using leaf brushes to create foliage quickly. Then the approach with modular trees using clusters as symbols for the first one, with one cluster colored via a color overlay effect, or using the even more modular approach with different elements that can be arranged into different trees using the same assets. And lastly, I used embedded objects for the final tree. Rather than use the edit object, you can also use the replace document and just change the graphic altogether. As long as the size is similar, it will work and all the clusters will be altered. There are infinite other approaches. These 6 are just the ones I like to use and compiled for this video. A simple tree example without and with blur. The blur adds depth to the scene. The simple trees with added patterns on top. These are texture brushes I created for another tutorial. They are placed on top or inside clipping masks. You can use various shapes for your clusters. You're not limited to leaves. I used spoons or even scissors and they still look like trees. Play around with it, have fun with shapes and colors. Combining various approaches into one scene works rather well. I have the simplistic trees in the background, more detailed ones in the front. Different trees like a willow can be created in the same way. It's just a different approach for the cluster itself. Here are two more samples of the leaves using texture brushes. Play around with it. It is a lot of fun. This is another tutorial video I recorded earlier. I tried to match the tree to the character. I hope you enjoyed this video. I find trees fascinating. It's a lot of fun to play with. Give it a try. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, leave a like, click on the notification icon, and I will see you again soon.